It had been centuries since the first contact between the Deathworlders and the greater galactic community, and for all that time we had kept our distance, watching, waiting, listening. Our reputation had traveled far and wide before we did. Other species whispered about us, about our planet, their imaginations fueled by stories of a world where survival was a constant struggle against nature's wrath. Earth, our home, was a place where life itself had to adapt in ways most couldn't even comprehend. We were forged by that brutal environment, shaped by the ever-present threat of extinction. Our evolution had created a species capable of surviving any disaster, any predator, and any threat. When we first made our presence known to the galaxy, it was with a sense of cautious curiosity. We weren't conquerors. We didn't have the interest in building an empire, spreading our culture across the stars. We had always been a solitary species, guarding our own interests and territories. We were content to be left alone, but the galaxy, with its sprawling empires and endless conflicts, took notice of us nonetheless. The first encounter was as tense as anyone would have expected. Our ships, massive and imposing, appeared without warning over the most neutral of star systems, and for the first time, our people came face to face with those we had only known through data and distant communications. There was fear, certainly. The lesser species, fragile and easily intimidated, looked at us as if we were a ticking bomb, ready to destroy everything in our path. And yet, we did nothing to harm them. The truth was that our world had never known the kind of luxury they had. We were not born to live in peace, and we had no interest in fostering a false image of utopia. We sought something different. We sought understanding. Despite our physical prowess, despite the strength of our warships and weapons, our leaders saw value in something greater than conquest balance. The galaxy was filled with species weaker than us, but those species were no less deserving of respect. For years, we held to that principle. We became peacekeepers of sorts, stepping in when conflicts arose, quelling violence where we could. Our strength became a symbol of stability. No one challenged the Deathworlders directly, because they knew we would always come to the aid of those who had earned our respect. But our involvement wasn't without its cost. We did not act out of altruism, we acted because it was the only way we knew how to exist. Peace didn't come naturally to us. It was something we learned to live with because we realized it was the only way to survive in a galaxy full of fragile species. Our strength was meant to protect, not to rule. We gave the galaxy our trust. We offered them the wisdom of survival, the knowledge we had accumulated over centuries of struggle. We didn't seek to control their worlds or their destinies. We stood as protectors, guardians of a peace we didn't fully understand but had come to value. But then, as time wore on, the cracks in our resolve began to show. The weight of maintaining that peace, of being the unyielding pillar for a galaxy of others, slowly began to fray the bonds that had held us together. We grew disillusioned with the endless cycle of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The galaxy, for all its beauty and complexity, was beginning to feel like a prison. And as the years passed, it became clear to us that the balance we had fought so hard to maintain was something no one truly understood, least of all, the ones we protected. We were Deathworlders. It was in our nature to survive, not to save. And the more we gave, the more we asked ourselves, why should we continue to carry the weight of the galaxy on our shoulders? We began to question the role we had taken, and in those moments of quiet reflection, something inside us changed. The peace we had fought for no longer felt worth the cost. We had been good, yes, but maybe being good had been our greatest mistake. The galaxy didn't know it yet, but the moment we stopped being good, everything would begin to change. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A few of us had begun to question the path we had taken. The endless battles, the interventions, the constant act of being the protector for every frail species in the galaxy it had worn us down. For centuries, we had been the bulwark, the unshakable force standing between chaos and order, but the toll it had taken on us was beginning to show. Our people, once proud and united in their purpose, now found themselves split between those who still believed in the role we had taken on, and those who no longer saw the value in sacrificing ourselves for a galaxy that seemed incapable of understanding what it meant to survive. The galaxy's reaction was slow, but it was there. The first few reports were simple strange behavior among our fleets, less presence on the front lines of galactic politics, a quiet retreat from areas where we had once been a constant force. No one thought it would amount to much. After all, we were the Death Worlders. We had survived the unimaginable. Surely our presence was still needed, even if we chose to pull back a little. But the signs were becoming undeniable. We had become disillusioned. What had started as an attempt to protect others began to feel more like a leash binding us to a galaxy that neither understood nor appreciated the sacrifices we had made. The first real crack in our facade came when we refused to intervene in a conflict between two Outer Rim factions, a conflict that, had it happened even a few decades prior, we would have immediately addressed. The smaller species on both sides pleaded with us, as they always did, knowing that without our intervention, their petty war would spiral into catastrophe. But this time, we simply watched as the conflict unfolded, letting the flames of war burn where they would. It wasn't that we didn't care. It wasn't that we had lost our compassion. It was just that we were tired. Tired of being the ones to patch up the messes of others. Tired of being expected to sacrifice our own resources and blood just to maintain a fragile peace that was never fully appreciated. In the council chambers, there were murmurs of concern, questions about whether the Death Worlders had become complacent or worse, indifferent. Our refusal to intervene wasn't seen as the measured response it was seen as a betrayal. It wasn't long before the accusations began. The Death Worlders are no longer trustworthy, they said. They've grown weak, and so, slowly whispers turned into shouts. Our once coveted status as Guardians was slipping away, and in its place was a growing sense of uncertainty. Would we stand by and allow the galaxy to burn simply because we had grown tired of holding the flame? At the same time, the more our people retreated from galactic affairs, the more we began to see things with a clarity we hadn't had before. The galaxy, in its endless complexity, had always seemed so vast, so interconnected. But now we saw it as something fragile, something delicate, constantly on the brink of breaking. The more we watched the smaller species squabble and fight over resources, the more we realized how little we had actually accomplished by trying to maintain a peace that never truly existed. It wasn't peace, it was a temporary lull between storms. They had learned nothing. They hadn't earned it. The tipping point came when we received reports of a large, aggressive species pushing into the fringes of the galaxy, terrorizing unprotected planets. For years, we had been the first to step in and stop such threats, using our immense strength to keep the balance. This time, though, something inside us snapped. We had watched enough. Why were we always the ones to stop the worst of the galaxy's horrors? Why had it always been up to us? We were not saviors, we were survivors. And so the decision was made. There would be no intervention this time. No fleet sent to stop the invaders, no battles fought on behalf of weak, desperate species. We had been the shield for too long. The galaxy was too broken, too flawed to be saved. It was time for us to stop pretending that we could fix it. The galaxy, unaware of the shift taking place within us, continued to spin on, oblivious to the fact that the Death Worlders had started to change. We weren't the Guardians anymore. We weren't the Protectors. And soon they would realize that without us, the galaxy would have to face its darkest truths. The first strike was not one of destruction, not at first. It didn't come in the form of devastating weapons or colossal explosions tearing through cities. The Death Worlders, as always, were strategic, cold, calculating, and unyielding in their resolve. Our first strike was something far more subtle, a message that echoed louder than any fleet could. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the calm before a storm. The fleets, the ones that had once been the backbone of our protective presence in the galaxy, simply disappeared. The ships that patrolled the borders of neutral systems, that ensured trade routes remained safe, were no longer there. The sudden absence was far more jarring than any show of force. For a moment, the galaxy thought it was an error, a miscommunication. Surely the Death Worlders hadn't abandoned their post, hadn't left entire star systems vulnerable to the whims of pirates, warlords, and galactic chaos. Surely this was just a glitch, a passing phase. But no one knew, not yet, that the Death Worlders had made a conscious decision. We had stopped being good, and in that simple, quiet withdrawal, the galaxy began to unravel. There was no announcement, no declaration of war, just a slow, deliberate retreat. We didn't send fleets to warn the galaxy of our shift. We didn't send envoys to explain our actions. Instead, we let them feel the weight of our absence. In one quiet moment, entire star systems found themselves exposed, their fragile security shattered by the realization that they could no longer rely on us. And then came the message. It was transmitted on every frequency, every communication channel that spanned the galaxy. It didn't come with fanfare. It didn't need to. The words themselves were simple, stark, and final. We are the Death Worlders. We stopped being good. It was a cold statement, a fact, more than a declaration. It reverberated across the galaxy like a shockwave. Those who had once seen us as protectors now understood the truth: the Death Worlders were no longer allies. We had grown tired, and now we would let the galaxy fend for itself. There was no immediate retaliation, at least not from the galaxy's leaders. For a moment, there was only confusion and disbelief. The species that had once relied on us for protection couldn't fathom the possibility that we would simply walk away. But as the days passed, panic began to set in. The smaller species, those who had always been vulnerable to the larger, more aggressive powers of the galaxy, began to see the truth for what it was. There was no one coming to save them anymore. They were on their own. The first signs of chaos emerged slowly, creeping into the darker corners of the galaxy where the stronger, more aggressive species roamed. Pirates who had once feared our patrols began to strike openly, raiding merchant fleets without hesitation. Warlords who had known better than to cross the line that the Death Worlders had drawn now found themselves free to expand their influence with impunity. The peacekeepers were gone, and without them, the galaxy fell into the hands of those who had always been hungry for power. At the same time, the political leaders of the galaxy scrambled to form alliances, to negotiate, to try and fill the void we had left behind. But it was too late. The damage was already done. No amount of diplomacy could heal the rift we had created by stepping away. And then the whispers began. Were we declaring war? Were we preparing to conquer, to claim dominion over the galaxy we had once protected? But that was not our aim. We had never wanted power or control. Our withdrawal was not a prelude to conquest, it was a statement, a warning to the galaxy that the Death Worlders were no longer in the business of saving anyone. The galaxy had always relied on us as their guardians, their silent protectors in the dark. Now, they would understand the cost of that dependence. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, it became clear to everyone that we had stopped being good not out of malice, but out of necessity. The galaxy was broken, and no amount of our intervention could fix it. The more we withdrew, the more the galaxy splintered, until the very foundations of galactic peace began to crumble. And somewhere, deep within the hearts of the Death Worlders, the realization set in that perhaps the galaxy was better off this way. No one could survive forever on the backs of others. Not even the Death Worlders. In the weeks that followed our declaration, the galaxy began to shift in ways no one had anticipated. The ripple effect of our withdrawal reverberated across every star system, every political body, and every fragile alliance that had held together the delicate fabric of galactic order. What had once seemed like a steady foundation began to crack, and no one knew how deep those cracks would go, or how far the consequences would spread. The initial shock turned to confusion and panic. Some species, particularly the smaller and more peaceful ones, couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. For centuries, they had relied on the Death Worlders for protection, for security, for peace. The absence of our fleets from their borders left them exposed, vulnerable in ways they had never experienced. The quiet, almost invisible force that had shielded them from the chaos of the galaxy was gone, and they didn't know how to function without it. Many of these species had never known true self-sufficiency. They had been coddled by our presence, shielded from the brutal realities of a galaxy that had no place for weakness. Their leaders, who once spoke of cooperation and galactic unity, suddenly found themselves scrambling for answers, looking for someone else to step into the void we had left behind. But the galaxy was not filled with saviors. the once strong empires of the galaxy. Those who had always been allies of the Deathworlders were now in disarray. They too had relied on us to keep the galaxy's balance intact, and with our retreat, their power structures began to crumble. No one, it seemed, was truly prepared for the consequences. The pirates, once deterred by our fleets patrolling the trade routes, now ran rampant. The lesser species of the galaxy found themselves at the mercy of opportunistic invaders. Warlords, long restrained by the looming presence of Deathworlder ships, began to conquer with impunity. The smaller, more defenseless planets that had once been under our protection were the first to fall. The stories of destroyed colonies, entire civilizations lost to the greed of the galaxy's worst elements, began to spread like wildfire. News of atrocities, of massacres and brutal conquests flooded the comm channels of every system. The galaxy was tearing itself apart, and the Deathworlders, once the stabilizing force, were nowhere to be found. But the greater powers of the galaxy, those who had long relied on diplomatic ties and political maneuvering, could only watch as the situation unfolded. They had never known true warfare in the way the Deathworlders understood it. Our people had been forged in constant struggle, in the crucible of a planet that had no mercy. They could not comprehend the depth of the change we had undergone, nor could they fathom what we had come to understand, that the galaxy, for all its beauty and complexity, was nothing more than a fragile web of self-interest, held together by a string of illusions. The larger empires began to crumble under the weight of their own corruption and inaction. They had relied too long on our intervention, assuming that the Deathworlders would always be there to clean up their mess. But that assumption was shattered. With no one to stop them, systems began to splinter, trade routes were cut, and entire sectors descended into lawlessness. Planets once thriving under the protection of our fleets were now abandoned, left to fend for themselves in a galaxy that had no room for weakness. And as this chaos spread, the Deathworlders watched from the shadows. We did not intervene. We did not offer help. Instead, we waited, observing, feeling the weight of the galaxy's collapse without the burden of responsibility. The warlords and pirates who had once been held in check by our strength were now free to expand, unchecked and unchallenged. The Galactic Council, once a beacon of unity, now found itself fractured, with each species scrambling to protect their own interests. There was no cooperation, no unity, only desperate survival. In those moments, the truth became clear. The galaxy had never truly been at peace. It had only ever been held together by the Deathworlders, by our willingness to shoulder the burden of others. Without us, everything unraveled, exposing the raw, fragile nature of the galaxy's supposed unity. The death of that illusion left only one thing in its wake: a power vacuum that would swallow anything left behind. For us, there was no satisfaction in seeing the galaxy fall apart. There was no joy in watching the chaos unfold. But there was a certain inevitability to it. The galaxy had asked too much of us for too long, and now, in our absence, they were facing the reality of their own weaknesses. We had never been saviors, nor had we ever wanted to be. We had been survivors, and it was time for the galaxy to learn what survival truly meant. And so, as the flames of war and conquest spread across the stars, the Deathworlders remained silent, watching as the galaxy writhed in the consequences of its own choices. The galaxy had always relied on us to maintain its fragile peace. Now, they would have to face the consequences of a universe that demanded strength, not kindness, and we would let them. The chaos that had erupted across the galaxy in the wake of our withdrawal seemed to only intensify with time. What was once a fragile peace held together by the Deathworlders had splintered completely. Warlords surged forward, their ships raiding neutral planets with terrifying efficiency, while pirates no longer bothered to hide in the shadows, their raids becoming more daring, their brutality unmatched. Planetary governments that had once leaned on our strength crumbled, and the systems that had once been the lifeblood of galactic trade were now barren, their colonies abandoned or wiped out entirely. The silence of the Deathworlders only amplified the desperation. In the days that followed, news of these atrocities spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Across all communication channels, the same message echoed: the Deathworlders were gone, and the galaxy was suffering for it. Former allies, who had once trusted us to act as the silent guardians of peace, now turned on each other in a frantic scramble for survival. The empires, who had always been too focused on their own expansion and growth, found themselves facing the consequences of ignoring the cracks in their foundation. Their fleets, once the envy of the galaxy, began to stretch thin as they tried to address multiple fronts, with no guarantee of success. In this new, fractured landscape, alliances were forged and broken in the blink of an eye. The larger powers of the galaxy attempted to form new coalitions, but these temporary arrangements were only ever as strong as the mutual interest that held them together. Once that interest began to wane, the unity dissolved, and they fell back into their old patterns of mistrust and greed. The smaller species, who had once been shielded by the Death Worlders, were left to fend for themselves in a hostile universe that no longer had room for the weak. Desperation led to barbarity, and once peaceful planets found themselves in the midst of violent civil wars or ruthless occupation. But perhaps the most startling change was the emergence of a new kind of power in the galaxy, one that had once been suppressed by the Death Worlders' influence. Species that had never dared challenge the established order now began to rise. Without the Death Worlders standing as an immovable wall, these races, often brutish, aggressive, and ruthless, began carving out territories of their own. They fought for resources with unrelenting ferocity, raiding weaker systems and carving their mark on the galaxy's history. What had once been fringe species, laughed at by more sophisticated civilizations, were now forces to be reckoned with. They had learned the harsh lessons of survival on their death worlds and knew how to survive in the brutal new reality that had unfolded. The galaxy, once so united under the guise of peace and diplomacy, had now become a battlefield. Yet the Death Worlders remained indifferent. We had chosen our path and we were not turning back. The loss of life, the destruction, and the utter disarray did not concern us. We had stopped being good. We had stopped playing the role of saviors, and in doing so, we had finally seen the galaxy for what it truly was: a collection of self-interested species, too weak and too fractured to ever truly maintain peace. But even in our detachment, something changed within us. The reality of what was happening in the galaxy, the violence and brutality that now swept across entire sectors, did not leave us unscathed. The brutality of those who had once lived in the shadows now seemed endless. It was as if the moment we had stepped away from our role as guardians, the galaxy had been consumed by a darkness it had long been hiding. Still, we did not intervene. Yet, as we observed from the silence of our own corner of the universe, one undeniable truth became clear to us: the galaxy had never known true peace. The peace we had protected had been an illusion, a temporary reprieve from the violence that was inherent in the fabric of the universe. It was a fragile construct that had depended on the strength of the Death Worlders to hold it together, and now, without us, that construct was falling apart. It became clear that this collapse was not something we could, or even should, stop. The galaxy needed to learn its own lessons. We had never been its saviors. We had been its enforcers, its silent protectors. But the galaxy had taken us for granted, expecting us to bear the weight of its conflicts without ever acknowledging the cost. Now, it would have to face the consequences of its own arrogance and complacency. And so, as the fires of war spread across the stars, we stood by, watching, waiting for the galaxy to realize what it had lost and what it had become. The Death Worlders had stopped being good, but in the absence of that goodness, the true nature of the galaxy had finally been revealed. It was a world of predators, and only the strong would survive. And for the first time in centuries, we weren't sure if the galaxy even deserved to. As the galaxy descended further into anarchy, the long-awaited consequences of our withdrawal began to unfold in ways we had never imagined. Once proud empires that had boasted of their might now struggled to maintain order, and the smaller species that had once sought refuge under the Death Worlders' shield found themselves defenseless. The age of diplomatic solutions was rapidly fading, replaced by a brutal, savage fight for survival. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, a strange shift began to occur. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's inhabitants began to understand what it meant to survive without our intervention. The warlords, who had once feared our fleets, now held dominion over vast stretches of space, their fleets growing stronger with each passing conquest. The pirates who had been mere annoyances were now the scourge of the trade lanes, seizing vessels and resources with ruthless efficiency. The galaxy, once bound together by a fragile peace, had fractured into a series of isolated systems, each desperately trying to protect its own interests. What was once a vast, interconnected whole was now a splintered reflection of its former self. The larger powers, those once secure in their dominance, now faced internal turmoil. The leaderships that had grown complacent, reliant on the Death Worlders' power to keep the galaxy's worst impulses in check, found themselves unable to deal with the rising tide of violence. Their fleets, stretched thin across too many fronts, struggled to defend the heart of their territories, let alone exert influence over the fringes of their domains. And in the midst of this crumbling infrastructure, smaller, previously insignificant species began to make their mark. The once dominant powers of the galaxy were no longer the only players on the field. It was the brutal strength of the Death Worlders that had kept the peace for so long, and now, with us absent, the weak were being consumed by the strong. Systems once regarded as safe were now battlegrounds, their inhabitants caught in the crossfire of an unrelenting war for power. The galaxy's darkest elements rose to the surface, and for the first time in a long while they held the upper hand. Those who had lived on the fringes, oppressed by the weight of the galaxy's more powerful species, found themselves empowered. They knew the art of survival had been forced to master it on their death worlds, and now they used it to carve out new territories, to rise from the ashes of a galaxy that had forgotten how to protect its own. But the most startling development was something no one had expected: the sudden emergence of new alliances among species that had once been bitter enemies. With the Death Worlders gone, many of the weaker species found themselves forming temporary coalitions, pooling their resources and forces in an attempt to stave off the growing tide of aggression from the more powerful factions. These alliances, born out of desperation, were a reflection of the galaxy's new reality, a reality where cooperation was not a luxury but a necessity. It was an uneasy unity, forged in the fires of war and bound by a shared desire to survive, but it was a unity nonetheless. Despite these temporary coalitions, the galaxy remained on the brink of collapse. The scale of the violence continued to escalate, with entire planets wiped out by the unchecked ambition of warlords and marauding fleets. The once proud cityscapes of some of the most powerful planets were reduced to rubble, their populations either killed or scattered. The vacuum we had left was filled with devastation, and in that destruction, a strange sense of clarity began to take root. The galaxy was broken beyond repair. For the first time, we began to question if the galaxy was even worth saving. We had stopped being good, but in the absence of our protective reach, the galaxy was left to face itself, its primal instincts, and its brutal need for survival. In watching this, we realized that perhaps the galaxy didn't deserve our protection. It had been too long reliant on the Death Worlders' intervention, too long shielded from the consequences of its own actions. The very species we had once protected had, over time, become more self-interested, more greedy, and more willing to let others suffer for their own gain. They had not earned their peace. We had once believed that we were the guardians of balance, but now it seemed more like we had been their enablers, perpetuating a lie. As the galaxy's infrastructure collapsed, as civilizations were obliterated and new powers rose in the void, we found ourselves no longer burdened by guilt or responsibility. We had let go of the idea that we owed the galaxy anything, and in doing so, we finally understood something that had eluded us for millennia. There would always be predators, always be those who sought to dominate and destroy. The galaxy would survive, or it would not, but it was no longer our problem. And so we remained in silence, watching as the galaxy shattered, knowing that we had given it every chance to save itself. We had stopped being good, and in doing so, we had finally freed ourselves from the weight of its failures. As the galaxy descended further into its chaotic state, something unexpected began to emerge. The survivors, those who managed to navigate the anarchy with cunning and ruthless efficiency, began to understand what the Death Worlders had always known: survival was a matter of adaptability, of recognizing when the old systems no longer worked and creating something new from the wreckage. In the absence of the Death Worlders, the galaxy, broken as it was, found itself in a period of dangerous rebirth. But this rebirth was not the kind of hope the galaxy's leaders had once envisioned. It was a brutal reordering of power, where only the strongest, most adaptable species could hope to endure. In the chaos that had followed our withdrawal, something remarkable occurred. The very species that had once been subjugated, humiliated, or kept in check by the larger empires began to rise, not with a cry for help or a plea for the return of their protectors, but with cold determination. The Death Worlders' absence had given them the opportunity to fill the void, and they did so with a tenacity that the rest of the galaxy was ill-prepared for. The warlords, once fringe elements, began consolidating their power. Entire systems that had been part of larger galactic empires now found themselves ruled by these brutal leaders. The pirate fleets, once confined to small, isolated sectors, grew bolder, attacking shipping lanes with unprecedented violence. And the smaller, more resourceful species, the ones who had been crushed under the heel of empires for centuries, began to reforge their destinies. Where once they had been overlooked or ignored, now they were forced to the forefront of the galactic stage, wielding their survival instincts like weapons. The larger empires, which had once stood as bastions of power and authority, found themselves scrambling to maintain control over their territories. The machinery of their vast bureaucracies slowed, distracted by the internal strife they could no longer ignore. Their military might, which had been an unquestioned deterrent for centuries, was now stretched thin, unable to combat the rise of these new, fierce powers. And as their fleets were diverted to fight battles on multiple fronts, the space between them and the emerging threats grew wider. But perhaps the most striking transformation came from the survivors themselves. They had never been as dependent on large, bloated systems of government and military might as the empires had been. Instead, their existence had always been centered on pragmatism, on survival. They knew the galaxy for what it was, a jungle, where only the fittest survived. The absence of the Death Worlders had freed them to pursue their own destinies without the constant pressure to conform to the ideals of the old order. The rise of these new powers, while unsettling for many, had a certain inevitability about it. For too long, the galaxy had relied on the Death Worlders as a crutch, a shield that had kept its worst impulses at bay. Now that we had stepped away, it became painfully clear that the galaxy's underlying structure was unstable, dependent on the false assumption that peace could be maintained through external control. The truth was simpler, harsher. The galaxy was a living, breathing organism that thrived on conflict, competition, and survival. For the Death Worlders, this revelation came with an unexpected sense of clarity. We had long been the enforcers of order, the unseen hand that had kept the chaos in check. We had carried the weight of the galaxy on our shoulders, maintaining balance, ensuring that the scales never tipped too far in favor of one species or another. But in doing so, we had only delayed the inevitable. The galaxy was always going to collapse in on itself. Its fragile peace had been an illusion. And so we watched, detached, as the galaxy continued its downward spiral. It was not our responsibility anymore. The galaxy had made its choice when it had relied too heavily on the Death Worlders' strength and had taken us for granted. Now they were paying the price. In our silence, we began to understand the true nature of the galaxy we had tried to protect. It was not a place of peace, nor was it a place of hope. It was a battleground, a place where strength and survival defined everything. The galaxy would continue, in its own way, whether it healed or shattered completely. And as we looked out across the fractured systems, we realized that perhaps the galaxy did not need saving after all. The Death Worlders had stopped being good, but in doing so, we had freed ourselves. The galaxy was now forced to face the consequences of its own nature. It would either adapt or it would perish. But whatever came next, it would no longer be our concern. We had learned the most important lesson of all: no one, not even the galaxy itself, was truly deserving of salvation. The survivors would carry on, as they always had, but they would carry the weight of their own choices. And the Death Worlders, the guardians of a broken galaxy, would fade into myth, leaving only the brutal truth of their departure.